Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual talk today with CSU DH, Asian Pacific Studies. My name is Dr. Wenli Jen. I'm an instructor at DH in the Asian Pacific Studies program and department, and also in the Health, Human Services and Nursing College in the Department for Health Sciences and Public Health. So I'm here to welcome you all, but I also wanted to give you a quick note and a quick plug. Our Asian Pacific Studies, we are definitely open and looking for people who want to major in Asian American Studies or Asian Pacific Studies. And we also have a minor. So after taking this class, if you are in APP 201, Introduction to Asian American Studies, or APP 212, Introduction to Comparative Ethnic and Global Societies, you can definitely use one of these classes that you've been taking to figure out if you want to take a minor. So you'll just have a couple more classes to go to have that minor. So quick housekeeping, make sure that everybody has their mute button for their microphone. And then I want to also drop into the chat later on the link for my information, so you can contact me at a later time if you need to. But let's give a big warm welcome to Dr. Raymond Chong. Dr. Chong, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us for this program. And just for information, I'm actually in Sugar Land, Texas. So it's a privilege to present this program, the Asian American Experience, 1882 to 1965. So I'm going to proceed with share my screen. And I'm going to go into my slideshow. And let me get this little bar away. How do I get rid of this bar here?
You could just click on it and then move it around.
Yeah, click on it. Where should I move it to? I can't.
Probably to like the right corner, right bottom corner.
Right bottom corner. Okay. Okay. Is that okay for visual? Is it okay now?
Yes, we are ready to go.
Okay, and then how do I move the slide?
You could press forward if you like. Usually on your screen,
yeah,
you should be able to press forward.
Okay, now showtime. I'm ready to go. So this is the Asian American Experience, and it covers 83 years from 1882 to 1965. This is Asian American Experience, and I'm Raymond Douglas Chong. My Chinese name, Zhang Weiming. That is my Chinese name. And a little background about myself. I'm actually a native of Los Angeles. I graduated from University of Southern California with a bachelor's degree, San Jose State University with a master's degree. I'm also a distinguished professor at Jintong Sindong University in Jinan, China. Background, I'm a historian. I've written, for example, A Lost Chinatown, Santa Barbara. I'm a writer, Chop Suey and Sushi, From Sea to Shining Sea. I'm a poet. I have my new book, Peony Amor, Sultry Ecstasy and Frosty Agony. I'm also a lyricist for my album, Villas of Dragon Hill, A Mystical Journey in Passion. And I'm also a filmmaker, My Odyssey Between Two Worlds. But going to myself a little bit more is I am here. My family's been here since 1849 to now, 7 generations. I'm the 6th generation of my family, the clan, the Chong Clan, to now. I'm the 6th generation. My son, my number 1 son, my only son, is the 7th generation. So we've been here 173 years in Gold Mountain, America. But this is a program that's going to be defined by this 4 topics: institutional discrimination tools, yellow peril; the core, the Asian American experience, 1882 to 1965, and the close. So this is our program for the next hour. And we're going to be talking about what is this institutional discrimination tools. Since the founding of America, there has been systematic discrimination by the white power or the white people in power through intimidation, scapegoating, appropriation, segregation, exclusion, dehumanization. And what I'm going to go one by example: intimidation, an act of intentionally coercing or frightening someone to cause them to do something against their will or to prevent them from doing something they want. And what you see in this particular picture was in 1887, a mob of white people descended into Chinatown in San Jose, California, and they burned it down. They forced all the residents who were working on the farms, the orchards of the Santa Clara Valley, and flee San Jose, Chinatown. It was utterly destroyed. That was 1 tool of intimidation by the white people. Another tool is scapegoating, blaming a person or group for the wrongdoings, mistakes, or faults of others. In the context of the 19th century in particular, us Chinese, we were the scapegoat for all the economic depressions. We were stealing jobs from the Americans, white Americans. We were driving down the wages. We were degrading the morality. We were the threat to the racial integrity or the purity of the white Aryan race. We were the scapegoat, us Chinese at that time. Eventually, the Japanese, the Filipinos, the Korean, the Sikhs, they became scapegoats. Appropriation, the action of taking something of one's own use, typically without the owner's permission. In this case, Hawaii, perhaps you didn't know that, but before 1893, it was its own sovereign nation, its own kingdom. In 1893, America took over the power, the whole territory of Hawaii, and annexed it in 1898 by Congress, appropriation. Cultural appropriation, to knowledge or inappropriate adoption of the custom, practices, ideas of one people or society by members of another, and typically by more dominant people or society. So what you see there in this image is a caricature, a cartoonist view of the indigenous Indians, Asians, Africans, Hispanics. We were not human beings. We were subhumans. We were not part of mainstream America. That was the perception created by the mass media at that time. Segregation, set apart or divide from the rest. Now, you know now, Chinatown is a chic place to go shopping, to eat the finest cuisines, whether it's Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, whatever. But from the 19th century to the 20th century, Chinese could not own property. We were segregated. We were only allowed in certain ghettos or barrios in Spanish. We were in the worst part of the neighborhood with dense quarters, poor living conditions. That was segregation for the Chinese in particular. Exclusion, deny access to a place, group, or privilege. And the fear against the Chinese was a threat to the white majority, the dominant society. And the outcry was the China Wall. We have to build a China Wall around America to prevent Chinese to enter America to work, to live. That was exclusion. And most crudely, dehumanization, claiming that a person or group of people is less than human, or that they're not like us. And they created an image, in particular at that time in the 19th century, and eventually Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, Sikhs. But for the Chinese, we were the whipping boys. We were miscast as subhuman, not part of this world. We were so different, we're so unique. We could not be inclusive. We could not assimilate into the greater American society. That was the dehumanization. That was intentional through the course of time, through newspapers, through silent film, through radio, through sound film, to our magazines. That was intentional since the beginning of America. And you wonder, were we Americans? And I'm referring to people of color. At the beginning of America in 1790, at the first Congress, they passed the Nationality Act of 1790. And the startling part for me, because I took my American history, was eligibility for citizenship by naturalization was limited. This vital right to free white people or persons. So First Congress of America in 1790 prescribed that only free white people could be naturalized as citizens. And this is 1790. And that was, to me, a startling discovery to learn that we were, us, people of color, whether you're African, Hispanic, Sikh, Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, we were stigmatized not to be a part of this America. The yellow pearl is the racial fear of Asian Americans. It is a racial color metaphor that we are a danger to the West, whether to Europe or to America, that we were subhuman, in particular looking at the Chinese, and there's reason to be fearful of the Eastern Asians, the Southeast Asians, the Southern Asians, that we were fear to the homogeneity racial makeup of America. But the point is, we are American. I'm American. Oops. But no matter how many generations we have left, we are considered perpetual foreigners. And that's a stigma, a stereotype. No matter how many generations, as you may, if in particular, if you're a people of color, they will ask you, where are you from? Where are you really from? They don't think you as an American. They think of you as the perpetual foreigner. Think about that. So this is a little snapshot of the waves of immigration from Asia. First, the Chinese in California in 1849 during the California Gold Rush. The Japanese in Hawaii in 1885 for the sugar plantations. 1903, the Koreans in Hawaii, again for the sugar plantations. In 1906, the Sikhs in Washington for the lumber mills of the Pacific Northwest, in particular Washington. The Filipinos in California and Hawaii in 1917 to be the sugar, to work in the sugar plantations. And you can see that trend. We, Asian, came as a source of cheap labor for the majority white society. So this is how our immigration path came about in the early days of the 19th century and the 20th century. The California Gold Rush from 1848 to 1855. 300,000 prospectors rushed to California, to Gold Mountain, as the Chinese call it, to search for gold riches in the riverbeds of the Sacramento American River. You were here to be part of our American dream, to seek our wealth in America. And later, from 1865 to 1869, the first Trans-Continental Railroad, a work of giants, where through Central Pacific Railroad, from Sacramento to the Sierra Nevada, to the high desert, to Promontory Summit, to build the western segment of the Trans-Continental Railroad, to meet on May 1869 to match and meet with the Union Pacific Railroad. That was a work of giants where there were roughly 20,000 Chinese were the main labor force, the Army of Canton going through the Granite Sierra Nevada. That was a work of giants, the Chinese. But the anti-Chinese sentiment, xenophobia, fear, and hatred of the Chinese, that was across the American West, in particular, especially in California, against unfortunately, the Chinese, the pioneers, the sojourners. It was an environment of violence. There were expulsions, massacres. That was what we faced for the Chinese at that time during the 19th and 20th century, the anti-Chinese sentiment. And people, the white American society, the government, the politicians, the business people asked the Chinese question, the dehumanization of the Chinese, that we were subhuman, that we were helpless, that we were no reason to exist, and that we were entitled to cruelty, brutality, prejudice, and discrimination. And that we were facing slurs, coolies, barbarians, Mongolians, pagans, that we were immoral. We were, again, subhuman. That was the Chinese question in California in particular. And the perception, again, San Francisco, Chinatown, we were segregated. But the way the media portrayed us was, it was the dens for gambling, opium, slave girls, that we were set aside, apart from the mainstream American society. And what we had to endure were with the anti-Chinese laws, the foreign minor tax, and only Chinese had to pay that tax. Chinese could not testify in court against whites. Mongolian women, in particular Chinese, had to be a good character. A white person cannot marry a Negro, mulatto, a Mongolian. There was forbidden miscegenation between whites and Mongolian. And we could not own property, even unless you were an American citizen. In San Francisco, under the municipal code, they had their own ordinance. No Chinese can be employed by government. Some silly laws like transporting goods on yo-yo poles across the shoulders prohibited. Gongs cannot be rung at the theater. No plays can be midnight and daylight. Lotteries are forbidden. Building materials are forbidden to be imported from China. Again, we were aimed at easy targets, the Chinese in particular. And then, as I mentioned about the anti-Chinese sentiment, in particular, in 1871, the Los Angeles Chinese massacre, Chinese immigrants. And it was an incident between two gangs over Chinese women, and it created a furor of that the white mob feared that they were going to be killed by the Chinese. So what they did instead was to go into Chinatown and kill, shot, and hung 17 Chinese at Negro Alley in Chinatown. So that was the massacre, the violence against the Chinese in particular. There was federal congressional acts, the Page Act, that prohibited the entry of Chinese women. And the rationale behind it was to end the danger of cheap labor and immoral Chinese women. And that kept a stereotype of Chinese women. Even now, they have this exotic, erotic image of a Chinese woman, was set in that tone back in 1875 to even now, that Chinese women are exotic, erotic, and they're temptress. And for us Chinese men, it created this bachelor society that there were very rare women that were coming to America unless they were wives of immigrants or child of new families. So that was another impact for the Chinese as a bachelor society. Another image that was perpetuated was the creation of the Chinese supervillain. Before, we were hapless victims, innocents, but now they create this illusion that Chinese, in particular, the mystery of Dr. Fu Manchu, the Chinese supervillain, that we're evil, we were subhuman, that we were demons, we were criminals, we were a threat to the West. That was the image, the new image, the evil, the gangster, the Tongs, the Chinese in particular. And in silent film, in this particular one, The Cheat, it was shot in 1915, this particular silent film. It created an illusion, a guise of the sinister Japanese who was a sexual predator, a white woman. They were elegant, but dangerous. So be fearful, especially for white women. And in serial magazines, the Peril of the Pacific, that there was a pending invasion of the Japanese to America. It created a myth, an illusion to create a fear of the Japanese that they may someday invade our America. And we're talking about illusions, stereotypes. Anna May Wong, the great actress of the golden age of Hollywood, born in Los Angeles. And the image she was portrayed on film was an Asian lady of obedience, purity, submission, or dragon lady, an Asian lady of danger, deviance, seduction. So for Anna May Wong, she could not break the stereotype. She was either typecast as the lotus blossom or the dragon lady. She could never move on to her true talent as an actress. Another part of us before, as a context of us being Asians, at that time, the yellow peril was yellow face. And the Hollywood studio system, the top 5 studios, the impression was Asians could not act as Asians on silent film or sound film. Only well-qualified European or American actors could play Asians. And in this case, to your left, Warner Olin, a Swede, as Charlie Chan. To your right, the famous actress Katharine Hepburn in Jade in Dragon Seed. So the Chinese, the Japanese, the Filipinos, the Koreans, we were stigmatized that we could not act except maybe for supporting roles. So all the major stars on film were yellow face, speaking in Pinyin English. And another stereotype is on tellers in particular, in Bonanza, Hop Sing, the stereotypical Chinese housekeeper. The continuing perpetuality of Chinese, in particular, being second class to the mainstream America. But now we move into the core of this program, the 83 years of the Asian American experience from 1882 to 1965. And in my mind, this is the crucial period of us breaking out from our discrimination as people of color. So in 1880, even though there were only roughly 100,000 Chinese out of a nation of 50 million Americans, there was a invasive fear of the Chinese that we kept coming through the steamships, that we were the giant Chinamen, and that they had to have the gate of America protected by the Golden Eagle. The coolies were coming like an invasion force. That was the perception, leading to the anti-Chinese wall. So everyone else, the Africans, the Irish, the Catholics, all the other groups in America, they had to build their own wall to protect their self-interest, because us Chinese were going to steal their jobs or diminish their wages. And they finally reached a climax in 1882. The infamous Chinese Exclusion Act. In particular, again, it's very focused on Chinese because we were the first scapegoat. It prohibited immigration of manual laborers from China. It prevented our naturalization of becoming Americans. It lasted from 1882 to 1943, that dreadful period. And you see this graphic, this is kind of in red, is the kind of exaggerated form, is the Chinese population, roughly 100,000 in 1880. And there was a form of ethnic cleansing. As America grew, you can see the population diminished to around 1920, when there were roughly 60,000 Chinese. And once we break through past 1965, the Chinese population has risen to 5 million. So you can see the challenge, what the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act had to the 1943. But this is not what's taught in my history book of America. There was the Chinese expulsion, the ethnic cleansing in the America West. There was a spasm of massacres, of exclusion, of burnings of Chinatowns, and also other ethnic communities, the Filipinos, the Sikhs. And it lasted 30, 40 years all across the America West. It was to rid of the Chinese because we were cheap labor, and racial violence was commonplace, harassment, assault, expulsion. In the course of that, Chinese, in particular in San Francisco, were segregated to what we call Chinese schools, Japanese schools, Korean schools, Oriental schools. But one family challenged that their daughter was entitled to attend to a all-white school. She challenged that norm, and the California Supreme Court agreed that it was unfair to exclude Chinese from the mainstream white schools. But after, the way to bypass it, they created new laws that still can perpetuate Oriental schools. So us Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, we were segregated in our own exclusive schools. in San Francisco. Here is the 1885, the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, where 28 Chinese miners, 15 of them were injured, but 20 were killed, 15 were injured, 78 homes were burned. And this was a riot between among their own fellow miners, the white miners, because Chinese, again, were a threat to their livelihood, about their wages, their jobs. 1885 in Tacoma, the Tacoma riot, Washington, the Chinese expulsion. And this was an organized effort from the mayor to the city council, to the police department, to the business people to systematically expose the Chinese. A mob of 500 expelled 700 Chinese. They forced them by train to flee from Tacoma to Portland, and they burned down Chinatown. They blocked it out, exterminated that. So there were no Chinese. This was in 1885, a systematic way to exterminate or exclude the Chinese. 1886, in Seattle, the riot, and again, it's part of the anti-Chinese sentiment, where the Knights of Labor, the pro-American white group, shipped roughly 300 Chinese to San Francisco. And that created a massive scandal and issue. So after that, there were no Chinese hanging around in Seattle in 1886. Again, another dreadful massacre, 1887, the Hills Canyon Massacre, Oregon, where there were 34 Chinese gold miners panning for gold. They were ambushed and murdered by a horse gang. 34 of them were slaughtered, their bodies dumped into the river. And what you have seen, the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre, the Rock Springs Massacre, the Hills Canyon Massacre, no one actually were convicted, or it was appealed, but none of them really served their sentence for their murders of the Chinese. A little side note, my great grandfather, Ho-Lin Chung, came to America, Go Mountain, as a paper son. And I'll explain to you a little bit later what a paper son. But to the left of that image is my great grandfather, Ho-Lin Chung, and to the right is my father, Jim Sui Chong. This picture was taken around 1923. So we arrived. He was the third generation to come to Go Mountain, America. But there were some triumphs, a few triumphs during the course of this period from 1882 to 1965. In 1898, in the Supreme Court, Wong Kim Ark challenged the right to have birthright citizenship that was guaranteed under the 14th Amendment. He was born in San Francisco in 1873. He left to visit China, came back, and he was denied to come back to his America because the immigration officials said, hey, no matter what, you are a subject of Imperial China. You are not an American citizen. He challenged it, and he won. And that was a rare triumph, that those, whether you're Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Sikh, you were entitled to birthright citizenship if you were born here. That was a rare triumph during those period, 1882 to 1965. And now let's continue beyond the Chinese, because I've been very focused on that. Was in 1898, America fought Spain, and this was the Spanish-American War, where America beat Spain. We took over Puerto Rico, Guam, but also we annexed the Filipinos, which was in a way its own colony of the Spaniards, and in a way its own nation. But to justify the annexation of the Filipino nation, they created a illusion, a caricature of, there was good reason why the imperial power of America had to annex the Philippines. They were primitive, they were subhuman. The Americans were there to educate them. So it was a good rationale as part of this manifest density of America to justify this annexation. So this is the impression that the Filipinos were primitive, subhuman. Then moving on to another significant period, 1900 to 1904, the bubonic plague in San Francisco, Chinatown, and the quarantines. And this is like echoes of what we face now in this, since 2000, COVID, 2020, that the Chinese were the only group of people that were quarantined. No one else. It was the Chinese were quarantined. They're harassed. So this is nothing new, what we're facing with COVID since 2020. But now, echo back to 1900, 1904, the Chinese had that same experience with the bubonic plague. Then, 1907, the Gentleman Agreement, no immigration of Japanese. It was a deal signed by President Theodore Roosevelt with the Empire of Japan to limit immigration of Japanese. There was a fear of Japanese laborers, again, would be taking jobs from the white American workers that would reduce the wages. So there was an arrangement done in 1907, a gentleman agreement. And this was next. In 1907, the Bellingham riot in Washington. And the early pioneers, the Sikhs, came to the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, and Washington to work in the lumber mills. And what happened in Bellingham, there was a riot. And it created a backlash of a mob of 500 white men. And they pushed out 125 Sikh workers out of the lumber mill and forced them to go back to Vancouver, Washington. And that was in 1907. And you hear about Angel Island Immigration Station, how significant it is. But it was a place of detention, interrogation. It was supposed to be a welcoming place, but it was actually a place to exclude Asians in particular. They were ruthless against, they suspected Chinese were criminals or evil people. So we were inferior. So we were mistreated, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Koreans, from 1910 to 1940. It was not to welcome us, but to cruelly exclude us from America. And many were deported. Maybe 20% of people who entered were deported after the interrogation. And again, the stereotype, 1910, the tide of the turbans, the fear of the Sikhs. It created that they were the subhumans, a threat to the West, taking jobs, that they were subhumans, they were primitive. It was that fear. It was being perpetuated intentionally. 1912, my grandfather, Moy Chung, arrived in San Francisco as a student. He was lucky. He did not have to go to the interrogation. Next is the Immigration Act of 1917, the exclusion of Asians. And basically, 1882 was the exclusion of Chinese in particular, but then at this particular one, this act was banning the immigration of Asians and Pacific Islanders to contain the yellow peril, to block the yellow invasion of Eastern Asians, Southeast Asians, and Southern Asians. That was a legislation by Congress. More restrictions. And this is another peculiar act in 1922, where it allowed citizenship by naturalization for some class of people. But if you were an American woman who were to marry an immigrant citizen, an immigrant who was not a citizen, you would lose your citizenship. In this case, this lady married an immigrant and she became a non-American, even though she was born in America. She lost her citizenship. In 1923, Bhagat Singh Tan challenged the law of naturalized citizenship. He claimed that if you're an Indian, you were actually Aryan, therefore you're considered to be a free white person, therefore you can be naturalized. He challenged it. He lost at the US Supreme Court. After his third try in the 1930s, he did finally became an American citizen. But there was people who were searching for justice, whether the California Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court. You're always looking for justice. Then there was the Immigration Act of 1924. It at the end prohibited, it restricted Asian immigration, made it more tougher, more restrictive. It was to preserve the idea of US homogeneity. It created the national origin formula that very limited to maybe 1% entitlement of Asians to immigrate to America. The rest were 99% European. 1930, the Watsonville riot in California, where there was a clash between the white farm workers and the Filipino farm workers. And it was actually two disputes in terms of jobs and over a white woman. And it created a riot in 1930, and there were assaults for a few days in Watsonville. That was a very tense period for the Filipino Americans, especially in the farms and orchards of the Central Valley. 1932, my father, Jim Sui Chong, arrived as a paper son. And you're wondering, what the heck is a paper son? A paper son is an illegal scheme to immigrate that you claim that you are a son of a naturalized citizen, if you're lucky, being Chinese. So you created an illusion of a paper father. You are his paper son. Therefore, you can come to America, and by extension, you become a citizen. So my father came as a paper son in 1932. Let's fast forward to World War II, 1941 to 1945, and Pearl Harbor, and what its impact in America, in particular for the Japanese American, the Nikkei community along the Pacific West Coast and Hawaii. And there was cruelty that all Japanese were still under the power of the Emperor of China. This is a cartoon saying, waiting for the signal from home, that any and all Japanese American were still loyal to their masters, the Imperial Empire of Japan, and that we were spies, saboteurs. And that was the fear of the Japanese along the west coast of America. It led to the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans from 1942 to 1946 by presidential executive order by Franklin Roosevelt, Executive Order 9066. And it had a vast impact across all of the Japanese towns, the communities that in a given period, they lost their homes, their businesses, they were uprooted and put into internment camps. From 1942 to 1946, there were 10 camps, if you can call it, or I could call it more like concentration camps in the desolate America West, primitive condition, sanitation, horrific situation. 120,000 Japanese and American, and 70% of them were Americans. And they were surrounded by guard watchtowers, barbed wire, fences. They had to bear that for 5 years, 1942 to 1946. And even during World War II, there even in the military, in particular in the Navy, there were segregated units. In this case, they were Chinese. And my father was a part of this crew that had managed to maintain the famous China Clipper, the seaplane. And here's another rare moment of triumph where Japanese Americans, Nikkei, the second generation, volunteered to fight for the American cause, in particular the European front in Italy, France, and Germany, where 4,000 volunteers were the most decorated regiment ever to sacrifice their lives. That was a rare triumph for our journey during that period from 1882 to 1965. And then finally, 1943, the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But it was a little subtle discrimination still. It was still being perpetuated in that finally us Chinese could be naturalized, but it allowed an annual quota of free immigration from China of 105 Chinese per year. 105. So that was a gesture to improve the relation with the Chinese government, since we were allied during World War II. In 1944, Fred Karamutsu challenged at the US Supreme Court racial discrimination by Japanese exclusion. And he was concerned about their civil rights as Americans. And the argument was it necessity for the military to exclude the Japanese for the fear of espionage? He challenged it and he lost in 1944, unfortunately. Then in 1946, the List-Celler Act, that created some naturalization for the South Asians, in particular, the Sikhs, the Indians. It allowed the annual quota immigration of 100 Indians or 100 Filipinos per year. Again, 100 per year. That was the quota. And let's move into this period, the Red Scare, 1947 to 1957, McCarthyism. And this was led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who took advantage of the fear of the red iceberg, the loss of Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall blockade, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War. He took advantage and created evil images, in particular, the Chinese with the red communist government. In 1952, this was the Immigration Nationality Act, and it led to more quotas that allow countries, other countries in Asia to immigrate to America, but the overall cap for all Asian countries was 2,000 per year. It did allow the Japanese and Koreans to be naturalized as citizens. So that was a rare victory, a small victory. 1954 to 1968 was the civil rights movement across America to address institutional racial segregation, discrimination, disenfranchisement, led by Dr. Martin Luther King. In the South, they had the legacy of the Jim Crow laws, and it was to address it through nonviolence, civil disobedience, to change the federal laws, to create a better society through civil rights, voting rights, ending the poll tax. That was the era from 1954 to 1968. And looking back, again, to the Red Scare, again, the Chinese stereotype that we were spies. Well, they created this Chinese confession program. They were looking for illegal paper sons among that. And there were a lot of confessions, a lot of fear. Eventually, 14,000 Chinese men confessed they were paper sons. And there was a lot of fear during that time. But here's another rare triumph. In 1957, Dalip Singh Song, he became, from California, the first Asian American Congress member from Riverside and Imperial County. He served 3 terms. He was a professor from UC Berkeley in mathematics. So he was our pioneer to serve in Congress in 1957. Another triumph, a Southern triumph, was in 1961, was the Flower Drum Song, a Broadway musical where we had an all-star cast of Asians in the main roles and the supporting roles. And what you see here, the main actors were James Sakita from Hawaii, Nancy Kwan from Hong Kong. And that was another rare triumph for us Asians in America. But ultimately, it led to this movement, the Civil Rights Act, that it outlawed discrimination at the federal level. It allowed equal voter registration. It ended racial segregation in schools and public places. It promoted the idea of a free employment workplace, that there was no further employment discrimination. That was a triumph for all Americans in 1964. But getting to 1965 was the catalyst moment of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, when Lyndon B. Johnson signed this particular act that ended the national origin formula. It removed the very specific discrimination against Asian, that was a golden day, and its impact has changed our America, in particular for our journey as Asian Americans. And what I've shown to you from 1865 to 1965, from 1882 to 1965, are the different significant events that there were harassment, violence, massacres, but there were some rare triumphs in the justice system. We still believe in that during those 83 years. And you can see the dramatic change for our journey here in American Gold Mountain, in particular for the overall Asian population from roughly 100,000 in 1880 and graphically going over time to now we stand at roughly 24 million for a country of 330 million. So that has an everlasting impact across America, whether you're Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Sikh. That has been a major impact. You can see the numbers has changed dramatically from 1965 to now. So I close with this point to share. The Asian Americans always face institutional discrimination due to all the tools that I had mentioned, the scapegoating, the dehumanization, things of that nature. Even now, yellow peril remains in America, even to this day, from 1790 to now. It has improved, but we still have a long road ahead of us. And those who were of Asian Americans who believe in the system, the pursuit of justice through immigration and civil rights, there were rare triumphs. And now, as I went through the 83 years, there were a few triumphs in the Asian American journey. But overall, we are true Americans. We believe in the American dream, and we still pursue it, our American dream. So most importantly, we are Americans. We belong here. So that closes my program. And here's some detail on my, if you want to contact me, whether through mobile, email, or WeChat. But this is a nutshell of my view of the Asian American experience from 1882 to 1965. And it highlighted the legacy, the history that we're still facing. And if we don't know our history, our legacy, we can't define our future better. So